All right, well, we are picking up this week in our study in Philippians. So we're in chapter 1. I'm going to pick up in verse 15. Paul says, "Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me affliction in my chains." So Paul here is in this section in the first chapter of Philippians talking about how he has seen the gospel progress, how he has seen the gospel kind of explode across the region, and specifically in this city of Philippi as he's writing to the Philippians. And in that progress, he has seen that those who are proclaiming the gospel have grown in courage, that they have seen Paul's example, and because of Paul's example, they're willing to be more courageous in how they present the gospel. So that was what he was talking about in last week in 12 through 14. And he picks up here in verse 15 talking about these two different groups of people who are proclaiming Christ. He says, "Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill." So he introduces these two groups. They're both proclaiming Christ. So he's not talking about false teachers. He's not talking about people who aren't speaking truth. These people are speaking truth. They're speaking and preaching the gospel. But he gets down to their motives. Some from envy and strife, and some from goodwill. Well, what do those mean? Let's go on in verse 16. He says the latter do it out of love. So this is the group that's doing it out of goodwill that he talked about in verse 15. So these people are doing it out of love, knowing that I, Paul, am appointed for the defense of the gospel. So these people understood who Paul was. They understood why he was appointed as an apostle. They understood what he was doing in proclaiming the gospel, and they were willing to stand with him even in his imprisonment. Even while he's imprisoned in Rome, writing the letter to them, they're willing to be identified with the apostle Paul. Because why? Because one, they love Paul, and two, because they love God first and foremost. Where we love God so much, we understand that God is the one who has saved us. He's the one who's given us love. So we're going to love Paul, and we're going to love others in our proclamation of the gospel. So everything that they do, their motivation is love. And so they're not willing to turn their back on Paul. They're not willing to turn their back on lost sinners in need of a Savior. They're willing to proclaim the gospel to those sinners. They're willing to be identified with Paul. And then he gets into this second group in verse 17, talking about them. He says, the former, so these are the ones who are preaching Christ out of envy and strife, they're proclaiming Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me affliction in my chains. And so these people, when I first read this, it's like, how can you proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition? Because you're speaking truth, but you're doing it out of a wrong motive. And that's really what it is the right words are coming out of your mouth, but you have incorrect motives in why you're saying what you're saying. And so he's breaking down this group here, saying that they're doing it out of a selfish ambition. Well, how can you be proclaiming Christ out of a selfish ambition? Think about it from the Apostle Paul's standpoint. The Apostle Paul had an incredible platform. He was going on missionary journeys. He was planting churches. Everybody recognized the Apostle Paul. He was famous. He still is famous today. And so these people, they weren't proclaiming Christ out of a heart of love, both for God, for Paul, for these lost sinners. They were proclaiming Christ because they saw the platform it gave Paul. They saw the recognition it gave Paul. They saw the spotlight that was put on Paul because of his mission, because of his apostleship. And they said when he got into prison in Rome, they were saying, oh, this is a chance for us to get the spotlight. This is a chance for us to get the platform. So let's look at Paul and tell everybody that maybe Paul has, a hidden sin in his life where, he needs to take care of that, and that's why he's in prison. That's why God allowed this to happen to him. And so they're willing to ridicule Paul. That's what he's talking about when he says, cause me affliction in my chains. They're willing to cause Paul affliction in that we'll run Paul's name through the dirt so we can get propped up, where our ministry can get propped up. Our names can become famous. Our spotlight can become brighter. And so that's what's going on here. That's how they could proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition. They knew the message that worked for Paul, so they took that message and they used it for their own gain. They said, we're going to try and do this where we can get the recognition. So you've got these two groups. One, who's proclaiming Christ out of a heart of love, and two, those who are proclaiming Christ out of selfish ambition. And so what should we learn this week from these couple verses? Well, the first thing is we need to understand that when we proclaim Christ, there will be those who criticize us. There will be those who look at us and say, I want to be more like them, so I'm going to criticize, not more like them. I want to have the following that they have, so I'm going to criticize them. To where if I criticize them, if people stop following them, they'll come start following me. That will happen when we proclaim Christ. We will have that criticism, and we will also have those who criticize us because they're unbelievers and they don't know the truth. They don't want to know the truth. And so it's important to understand when we proclaim the gospel, when we proclaim truth, there will be those who criticize us. We will have critics. Two, another thing we should learn is we need to be content with the role that God has given us. This group was not content. This group in verse 17, the ones who were doing it out of selfish ambition, they were not content with where God had placed them. They wanted to have the pedestal. They wanted to have the platform. They wanted to have the spotlight. And that is why they were willing to ridicule Paul, to cause him affliction in his chains. So we need to learn from this group, understanding that God has equipped us in different ways. We all should be spreading the gospel, but how that plays out in our lives as far as the results will vary. And so we need to be content with the role that God has placed us in. So that's two. And then three, we need to contend for those who identify and preach the gospel. We need to identify them and relate to them, and that we identify with them. Saying, if somebody is put in prison for proclaiming the gospel here in Panama City Beach or here in the U.S., we should identify with them because we stand for the same gospel they do. That's what this group who was proclaiming Christ out of love, they loved Paul, and that they weren't going to turn their back on him. We're going to stand with Paul because he stands for the gospel. He's an apostle for the gospel. And so that's another thing we should learn. We should understand we will have critics. We should be content with the role that God has placed us in proclaiming the gospel. And we should contend with those who do the same. So those are just a few quick lessons from these couple verses. Hope you guys have a great week.